up and so on, saying that, you know, their lineage is real long and all these sorts of things. So we can't trust any of the numbers. But using the generally accepted numbers for our recent history of these several thousand years, there is a group of people that from about the 600s, so about 630 maybe AD, in Europe, were known as the cathars, okay, the cathari. And they are, boy, I can't get into all of this history. It'd take literally days or weeks. There's vast amounts of history. I'll put some links to some of the historical references to the cathars, to the cathari, that have some validity to them. So you have to, again, you got to take everything you read about the cathars with a grain of salt. The reason, you know, you have to disbelieve most of it. You have to validate most of it, because the history is deliberately obscured by the Catholic Church. So if you read the Codex Oralinda, you run across the people that are the cathari. And the cathari are an interesting group, but let me get back to the disclaimer. By way of disclaimer, on both sides of my family, my mother's side and my father's side, we are cathari. All right, we're descended from the cathari. My father from the Germanic, the Teutonic version of them, and my mother from the Franco, the French version of them. So my father's people were driven out out of southeastern Germany, and eventually settled in Scotland and England. And that began in like the late 900s, okay? Fuck, what the hell was that? Sorry about that. It was an eagle landing very heavy on the roof because he's carrying a fish. So it was like a thump. So anyway, it's a big hollow building and it sort of echoed in here. Sorry about that. Okay, so so my father's family was suppressed by the Catholic Church in the Great German Inquisition that extended over several hundred years. And the Catholic Church they'd basically march out of Rome, come on up into southern Germany and wipe out all the women, steal all the children, and wipe out all the women, as I say, claiming them to be witches. And it was as a slave trade kind of thing, right? It was a very aggressive deal. And they were doing this against the Cathars for a couple of hundred years in Germany, and this was the German Inquisition. That was the horror that led to the Catholic Church refining the techniques they used on the unconverted Jews in Spain later on in the 1500s, okay? 14 and 1500s. Well, 13, 14, and 1500s. Anyway, so Catholic Church is, they're my enemy, right, historically, the organization. And so about the 1200s, the late 1100s, early into the 1200s, the Catholic Church they pretty much wiped out the Cathars in Germany, put them underground. That's one of our traditions, is that we're underground. We don't tell people shit about ourselves. Anyway, so as you can see, you know, with good reason, it's a survival issue. The Catholic Church declared the Cathars finally in the 1100s. Up until that point, they had just been yet one of the unrepentant, unabsorbed Christian sects. Okay, so up until I think it was like 1189, we'll have to go dig into the Vatican's records to find out. Up until about that period of time, the Catholic Church considered the Cathars basically like the Essenes, okay, from which Joshua, that we call Jesus, was extracted. The Essenes are a Gnostic sect, okay? They are known as the enumerators. They like numbers and they write lists. That's their whole thing, right? Is the Essenes were under, I won't go into it, but anyway, the Essenes are known as the enumerators because they liked listing things and finding things out. The Cathars were also considered to be one of these heretic Christian sects. Now, I'll put stuff in there that'll tell you about the Cathars. Bear in mind that most of this history is bogus because it's written from a Christian perspective, a Catholic perspective, and it's been polluted by that perspective over all these millennia, over a millennia plus, right? Because it goes back to about, as I say, the 600s. The persecutions began in the 800s, and we've been suffering them ever since. And finally, there was the great push in the early 1200s where the Templars, okay, so the Cathars in France extended as far north as a little bit past Rouen, which is a village in northern France. You can't see it here, but it's up approaching towards the border with, well, actually Alsace-Lorraine, Germany. It's over towards that way, but there's Rouen up in here on the river there. Just north of there, you got to get into Holland and in that area, right? The Netherlands, the Low Countries. Anyway, my mother's people were out of Rouen, and they were forced out. So my father's people were forced out in the late 1100s over into England and Scotland, from which they came to the U.S. My mother's people were denied entry into England. The English wouldn't have them because they were fighting with the French at the time. And so at this point, and also they were having their own issues with the Templars. The Templars were allied with the Cathars politically and economically in many different ways. Not religious. The Cathars in no way participated with crusades. It was against the ethos of the group to go and do this kind of stuff. It was a real problem for the French who were trying to get up these big crusades. Anyway, there was this giant crusade to eliminate the Cathars in the 1200s, and it pushed all the Cathars out of France over the course of about 120 years or so. It moved all of these groups of people out of France, slaughtered many of them. It's known as the expulsion of the Cathars from France. In that period, and it's basically like what some groups had done to other Cathars in other situations, even though at that time, or prior to that time, they were considered to be basically in the same religion, just a heretical sect, right? It was sort of like Sunni and Shia in Muslim world. They fight each other, they don't agree, and that kind of stuff, but they both sort of acknowledge that each other are Muslim, you know, in some degree, right? And so this was the state of the Cathars and the Christians. Now, the Catholic Church declared that, the Pope declared that the Cathars were not Christian and therefore could have a crusade against them. They got a big crusade against them and they flushed all the Cathars out of France. Now, we're talking about moving a core group of probably close to 750,000 people out of Europe, 250,000 easily in a couple of areas in southern France. My mother's people in Rouen were at the far northern extent of the Cathars. And the Cathars are not a warring people. They're into self-defense, but they're not aggressive in that sense. They don't go out and conquer territory that way. One of the central things about the Cathars is that they work. So there's no, okay, so Cathars have these people that would be thought of as priests that are called the perfecti, okay? And then there are the people that are on their way to becoming perfecti, and these are the credentes. Comes from the same root word as credential. And these are people that prove their worth, all right? But here's the thing. In the Cathar tradition, everybody works, all right? Work is a sacrament. And thus, there's natural outcomes to this. So there's no such thing as a priest that sits on his ass and takes money from parishioners and lives on those donations and stuff. That's not the structure that is organized within the Cathars. Everybody works. The donations to the common good do not include supporting people that have no other job. So even the people that we would think of as priests, and they're really not priests because there was no dogma per se, there was no codification at that level. although there was ritualization of certain things, there wasn't this written down catechism kind of thing, right? So it's a different approach to things. Anyway, and also a very different tradition, very, very, very different tradition, because the Cathars knew that the Old Testament never should have been part of what was, that came out of the Essene Joshua. And that's how he's known, as Joshua the Essene, not Jesus, right? Anyway, so the Cathars, as workers, naturally produced. They made things. And so energy begats wealth, right? If you do something and you make something, you benefit from having made that thing in so many different ways. And so there is this natural side effect of the particular ethos of the Cathars, and that is that they become wealthy over time because everybody works all the time. And it's a joyous kind of a work, right? Anyway, so the Cathars are an anathema, right, to the Catholic Church, that which the Catholic Church hates. They can't have people that are self-determining, and there's decentralized the Cathars would have no church in their territory. They would not have any organization that they would not allow the Catholics to put a priest or a structure of a church in their territory. This really pissed the Catholics off. So the Cathars cannot be proselytized. They can't be infiltrated that way, right? Because they accept no power structure. And so they accept, basically, the ruling is that the understanding is that there is no separation between man and God, except what man might put there. And you allow no man to separate you from source, from the Godhead. So anyway, the Cathars knew that the Old Testament never should have been joined to the New Testament, to the New Covenant, that the Old Testament was lies. And they've known this since early translations. The Cathars they work all the time. They're very literate. They produce, they have an understanding of education that is not schooling. They have the understanding of reincarnation. That was one of the things that really pissed the church off. They'd spent the last 300 years from like the very end part of the Constantinian collection of Christian sects. At the very end there was the Catholic Church, and then there were a couple of these heretic sects, like the Cathars, that had enough believers, enough adherents, that the Catholic Church couldn't just roll over them. Now, bear in mind that the Cathars work. They're also very martial. There's a martial tradition, a martial arts tradition within the Catharian understanding of the world, that the world is harsh, because okay, so there's two premises, reincarnation, metempsychoses, right? And decentralization. That's another big premise, that we accept no central authority, nothing between you and the source. But there's also this other tradition there within the Cathar understanding of duality, duality in universe, good versus evil. So you know, if you're a Cathar, that evil exists, and therefore you must defend yourself against it. You know, it is your task in universe and materium to work on the side of good and resist evil, and that's just one of the things you do. And so it's the same from this tradition that the Cathars have. The Sufis take their approach of that ultimately became twisted and so on into what we think of as jihad now, which they have as holy war. But that jihad, actually the word means internal struggle. It means exactly the same thing as the words kung fu, right, which is internal work. And so the Cathars have this internal work ethos. And so they were, as I say, an anathema to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church could not exist with them. They were finding that the Cathars were spreading very fast among the Franks and among the Gauls. They'd also had to be rooted out in the Teutons, and that was a hell of a battle, and it cost the Catholic Church much wealth and a big drag down on them, right? Now, all this is before the discovery of the United States, or the North America and South America, etc., right? But the Cathars, going back to the 600s, had a tradition that they knew that the cathari did not exist and did not come out of the Middle East, okay? That Godhead did not arise out of Israel or any of that, and that most of the books of the Old Testament are describing evil, and so you get this thing, right, where from a Catholic's perspective, in the Middle Ages, especially the Catholic serfs and all these people that are uneducated, can't read, and are relying on the priests to badly interpret and tell them stories out of this book that supposedly was written by God or inspired by God, and in fact is just the family history of the Israelites dealing with this space alien called Yahweh, who was one of 240, over 240. We know that there were over 240 of the Elohim here on earth in 15 of these Gans, G-A-N-S. Gans is not translated as garden. That's what the Catholic Church and all of these people would translate it to, the Garden of Eden. And it's E-D-I-N, right? It's a particular place name that describes basically Mesopotamia here down through the Fertile Crescent into Egypt, okay? So the Cathari up here knew that their tradition, their civilization came from North America. That in fact it came from the center back over here, which was one of the first that was established. So when the Elohim came to earth, they established these 15 genetic centers that they called Gans. In the Gans, the description of it in the Cathari understanding is that these are literally actually bubbles over, and they're like force fields. They're bubbles over areas that alter the relationship of the environment. It is an encapsulation that these Gans, these gardens, as inappropriate translation, are encapsulations. They're laboratories. And the kind of laboratory is that the Elohim were able to throw up an electrical shield, electromagnetic shield, that prevented the air from coming in and filtered what light came through. Now, light is very important to the Catharians, okay, and this is why we're generally working our way towards the understanding of medbeds and discussing that. But anyway, so in the 600s, according to my family tradition that I get from both sides of my family, and bear in mind that this is a traumatic event, right? And so one of the things about the Catharians is that there are people among the perfecti, among the religious part of it, those that are good credentes, that are moving their way up into what we can think of as priesthood. They are required to carry the knowledge, and they are required to carry it in a particular way, basically that we would describe as a grudge, okay? So I'm holding a grudge for my family that goes back in my father's lineage back into the 1100s, and in my mother's lineage back into the 1200s, because we were assaulted, and our people were crushed. They were killed. There was a crusade. There were it was recorded that there were 200,000 of the Cathari in southern France that were killed. Now, it wasn't all of them. They moved. A lot of them went into Spain. My mother's people went they were far north, so they were the ones that were first hit. And they had to move through the south, and they ended up going over Spain and into Portugal. And from Portugal, they went to the Azores, a small island chain there. We know it with the La Palma volcano now. And from there, they went over to the Caribbean. So the pirates of the Caribbean are Cathars. Okay, the remnants of the Cathari, I don't want to say religion, because it's more than that, right? It's a lifestyle. It's the Cathari don't really proselytize. They don't try and convert people or any of that. We just work, okay? And in doing our work, we advance. And if others want to follow, they follow, and that's fine. But because we're decentralized and this kind of thing, there's no possibility of a flood of converts that would overturn the nature of the religion. It's not really a religion, it's an ethos. There's a big difference. because there's no dogma per se, right? Anyway, so the Cathari became the Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, my mother's people were Caribbean pirates. My father's people left Scotland and came over through New York and ended up moving over into Central America, central part of the U.S., right? My mother's people were Pirates of the Caribbean when the British got really, really pissed at them a few hundred years later, and there was this big effort on the part of the British to destroy the Caribbean pirates here because they were raiding the ships of these people as they were attempting to get slaves and spices and all of this kind of stuff into their rum factories here. Bear in mind that they were producing rum in Cuba just like 20 years after Columbus, right? So in the early 1500s, maybe even before that. But in any event, so when the English came down and had their big purge and pogrom, my mother's people, the Pirates of the Caribbean, moved out of the Caribbean and they went up the Louisiana Mississippi River Delta. They took refuge there. They weren't able to be pursued there because they had small